Hi, and my name is Leo. I'm from Plant Resources, and today I'm joined by Lisa Annese, Chief Executive Officer of the Diversity Council of Australia, to chat a little bit more about inclusion and diversity in the workplace. So, welcome, Lisa. Good morning.
Thank you for having me.
Firstly, can you explain a little bit about DCS work for us?
Yes, we're a not-for-profit member organisation. We've been around for a few decades, actually, quite a few decades. But who we are today is that we work with employers to improve their capability in diversity and inclusion across the whole spectrum of diversity identities or diversity groups. We do this using an evidence framework. We have quite a sophisticated research team, and our influence is quite significant. Our members represent over 20% of the labour market. We have 1,200 Australian organisations who are our members, but we have a broader charitable purpose, which is to create more inclusion in the Australian economy. I mean, what we know is that 3 million Australian workers are underutilised and underleveraged. Many of those individuals are from marginalised groups. We also know that employers have a shortage of skilled talent, so it makes economic sense to match those two groups. So we have a moral imperative, but there's a real practical business imperative, and that's the space that we work in.
Beautiful. So obviously diversity and inclusion, I feel like lately is sort of a bit of a buzzword. And obviously that means different things to different people. So if you could please sum it up, what does actually diversity and inclusion in the workplace mean to you?
Well, I mean, the thing that's important here is it's not really what it means to me. It's what does it mean? And I think in this space, there are a lot of people who are really guided by their emotions. But what we try and do with workplaces is define diversity as a collection of personal and social attributes, many of them attributes protected by law, such as sex and gender, disability, race, age, but also including other aspects of your identity, like your social class. You may have caring responsibilities. You may have faith or religion. And we know that everyone can slot themselves into these groups, these identity groups. So what diversity really means is that, we have communities where people have got lived experiences in lots of different areas, including their gender, sex, age, race. And these things influence how they view and see the world, but they also influence how they operate in the workplace, because people access opportunities differently depending on their social identities. And what we also know is that people are more than just one aspect of their identity. They are a multitude of many of them. Yep. Inclusion we define as a process of making workplaces function effectively with a diversity of people. And I get very frustrated when inclusion is discussed as this warm, fuzzy, vague sense of belonging. Yep. And even though that's important, we define inclusion as a workplace environment that is respectful. So zero tolerance to bullying and harassment. A workplace environment where people are humanly connected to each other. Even the most introverted person needs human connection. Yeah. But importantly, a lot of people stop there. The other two aspects of inclusion are really critical. People need opportunity for advancement, and that could be personal development or professional development, or it could be linear progression in an organisation, depending on how big it is. And then finally, we've got a component that talks about contribution. So work has to be designed in a way where people have meaningful work that enables them to contribute to the purpose of the organisation. Inclusion needs all four of those aspects of function to be operating: respect, connection, advancement, contribution. We measure this empirically every 2 years in an inclusion index. And what we find is that when organisations rank high on those four aspects, we deem them to be inclusive employers. But organisations that do well in those areas are more innovative, more productive, people give more discretionary effort. There's a reduction in absenteeism and a reduction in risk. So this is a business, and this is an effective business strategy. Focusing on inclusion will make you more successful as an organisation. But the complexity of inclusion increases the more diverse you are.
Yes. Thank you for that. I've always wondered what inclusion means. Diversity, I feel it's sort of defines itself by the definition of the word diversity, but inclusion, thank you for that. Because I think, like most people, I also thought a bit more of that, what you said earlier, that fuzzy, everyone can come together and be included. But I think in a workplace, it is a bit more defined.
It has to be defined. If it's not defined, you can't action it. And I see well-meaning organisations spend a lot of time focusing on the warm and fuzzy.
Yeah.
And what happens is that, they'll set up a pride network, or they'll get a float at Mardi Gras, or they'll do a parents network, and those things are fantastic for connection, and they're really good sending signals and symbols. Symbols are important.
Yep.
But if you've returned from parental leave and your career's going nowhere, it doesn't matter whether there's a parents group and something happens on International Women's Day.
Yeah.
If your organisation has a float at Mardi Gras, but you have to self-edit in certain situations because your organisation doesn't call out homophobic behaviour from clients or customers or patrons, then that's not an inclusive workplace environment for you. So it's a hard thing to do, and I think that's the focus has to be on how do we create genuine cultural change in our institution and in the areas around it that we influence, because that's the thing that's going to make a difference to people.
Yeah. And sort of probing a little bit more on that inclusion part, obviously, do you have any examples in terms of how or when a workplace or an organisation have been successful in creating an inclusive workplace for their employees?
There are lots of examples. Many organisations have done a lot of fantastic work. You probably won't find any perfect organisation, because organisations are just groups of people lumped together, and individuals are flawed, and people bring behaviours to work that are sometimes not fantastic. I mean, I don't know if you've heard the adage, this is a popular one in the diversity space, bring your whole self to work.
No, I haven't.
No, that's a big one in the diversity world. We want people to bring their whole selves to work. And what I'm saying is you actually don't. You want people to bring their best, respectful selves to work. Because if some attitudes you don't want in the workplace, some behaviours that people might think are acceptable in their life, you want them to leave that at home. So where I've seen organisations be successful in this is where they've approached it in a methodical, strategic way, using a change management framework where they articulate a business case for what to do, and then they go through a process of designing effective change, engaging with all of the right stakeholders, building their capability, designing change that will work, and then evaluating what the success or lack of has been, and then learning from that. Sometimes the excitement around, let's do something for NAIDOC Week or for Harmony Week, and people think, I've done the diversity thing, but it's not that. Workplace culture is made up of every interaction every human has with every other person in the workplace. It's the composite of all the workplace policies and those invisible processes and structures. Who gets ahead? Who gets promoted? Who gets the opportunities? What happens when you start to work more flexibly? Do you fall off the career path? What happens if you call out bad behaviour? Are you labelled a troublemaker? What happens if the way you operate isn't the blueprint for leadership because you're introverted or you have a disability or you're from a particular cultural group where a different type of behaviours are seen as respectful and valuable? Unless you focus on those things using a change management lens, you'll always default to like a dominant group. And every organisation has its leadership blueprint. Everyone knows what the rules are. You know, because people behave within the context of those rules. So if there's bad behaviour and people get away with it, that's because the culture enables that bad behaviour because people aren't held to account for bad behaviour. So that stuff's hard to do, holding people to account, especially if they're senior, especially if they're big deals in the organisation. So a lot of this stuff, where it's worked effectively, has required courageous leadership in organisations, and it's required commitment in terms of resourcing and in terms of we're going to support people to know how to do this, because we don't instinctively know how to do this. I mean, some people are naturally better than others at dealing with difference, but for the most of us, we're comfortable with people who are like us. We're comfortable with sameness. That's what we attract in our friendship groups, and that's totally acceptable. That's fine. It's just that in a workplace, when you've got diversity, you need the process of inclusion to make sure that all kinds of people have opportunity. And that takes you need a mature, courageous approach that's resourced effectively in an organisation. And it might start with big gestures and with symbols, and those things are important. But I often hear disillusionment in places where individuals might be in organisations that think, they say all the right things, but they don't work on the culture.
Thanks for that. So following up on that a little bit more, the DCA recently reported on inclusive recruitment practices. Can you please share some of the key findings from that report?
Well, what we found is that inclusion in recruitment is it's a very flawed process. Again, it's recruitment is done in two ways. It's done using human beings who are flawed, and it's done using artificial intelligence tools that are also flawed because they're created by human beings who are flawed. And so what you find, we also know that the recruitment industry is quite homogenous. There's not a lot of diversity amongst recruitment organisations, and I'm not having a go at them. I think a lot of them are trying to change that. We also know that human resources practitioners as a profession, again, could benefit from having more diversity in their ranks, because you can't be what you can't see, and you don't pick up on things. But we also know, and this is what we found out, is the process for recruitment is flawed and excludes people. That starts with the way the job ad is written, the way it's advertised, where it's advertised. If someone has an accessibility issue and needs a particular bit of technology to access a computer job ad because of their disability, they're always going to be overlooked in getting from the application to interview stage. We know that if you have, and there's been research on this, if you have a non-Anglo-Celtic surname or name, You have to send in many, many more applications, the same application, to get to interview stage. I think it's 68% more if you have an Asian name. I think it's in the 50% more if it's Middle Eastern. I'm getting the stats. They may not be 100% correct, but the same application, just a different name. So there are real invisible barriers. Then we know that the interviews are flawed processes. If you're neurotypical, for example, you might need an adjustment for that interview to take place so that you can really shine. The interviews are designed for particular types of people. Some people do really well in them, and we know they're not great predictors of workplace success. So if you're basing all of your decisions just on that interview, that's going to be flawed. We know if you use artificial intelligence tools, even things like the background that you have will register with the AI tool, whether someone wears glasses or not, will register a different. I've read one study where they were looking at artificial intelligence tools and video interviews, and they looked at someone having glasses and it ranked them being more or less agreeable in their personality profile.
Really?
Or more or less, and even having a picture in the background, depending on what the picture is. So imagine if you had a wheelchair, imagine if you had a guide dog, imagine if you're from a low socioeconomic class and you're living in a multi-generational family. Imagine if you've got children running around in the background. Think of the people who are most likely to be impacted by that. So we know that artificial intelligence tools look at natural language patterns. When English isn't your first language, you might speak English in a more formal way.
Yes.
That might rate you as being less of a team player.
Yes.
So
I've heard that before.
that's just the interview.
Yep.
Then we look at what happens in terms of people, the skills of the humans who are doing that work, who are sort of making those judgments. We know, for example, if you want to interrupt that bias, just doing something as simple as not ranking people as full human beings and ranking. So say you had 3 people that you're looking at a job for. Instead of looking at person 1, comparing them to person 2, comparing them to person 3, you interrupt the bias if you look at criteria 1 and then compare person 1, 2, 3. Forces you to stop thinking of them as a whole person, and it forces you to focus on their actual merit. Okay, and those are things that interrupt bias. So we know that people are under-leveraged and underutilised and overlooked. The way institutions design jobs, they sometimes don't think out of the box. They think, well, the previous person did it this way, so I need that. Without thinking, maybe I could structure this job in a different way. And the thing is that we sometimes expect a lot from managers without giving them the skills to understand how to do it. So effective D&I change requires the investment into anyone who's involved in recruiting and any human who manages other people, because otherwise it's flawed.
That's very insightful. Thank you. I've heard about the non-Anglo-Celtic names. I've also heard about same resume, male and female names.
Yep.
I think I've heard that. The AI one is that was new. That is quite interesting. So thank you for sharing that.
Artificial intelligence, we don't have a view on whether it's good or bad. What we say is it can be either. Yeah. And so, but because big organisations are doing mass recruitment and use these tools.
Yes, they do. And I've also heard about the formalness of English is not your first language as a feedback from another interview, is that they come across too formal.
I know.
And I thought, okay, is that a bad
you try and
thing?
speak in another language. Good luck.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
So I've had that sort of frank conversation before when I said, well, English is not my first language and I'm okay. So So thank you for that.
The other thing, though, is that we need to challenge what we mean by teamwork.
Yes.
Because it's going to look different if you've got diverse groups of people. You know, not everyone wants to go for drinks on Friday night.
Yes.
If you're pregnant, you don't want to go.
Yep.
You might be from a particular religious or cultural background. You may not want to go. You may not be able to get there because you've got elder care responsibilities.
Yep.
So you've got to think about, what does a team mean and what does building team culture actually mean? And if you've got diverse groups of people, don't just assume that it's in your image. Well, I like to do this, and that might be acceptable for your friendship groups.
Yep.
But at work, what's important is, how do teams collaborate?
Mm-hmm.
How do teams share ideas? How do they solve problems together? And it might have nothing to do on people actually being able to get along and having a drink on a Friday night, for example.
Yep. Yep. If an organisation want to start today, get starting on creating a workplace that values diversity and inclusion, do you have any tips? Or what are the first things they need to do? What do they need to look at within their own selves to get there?
2 things, maybe 3 things. The first thing is they need to answer the question why.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to come up with a business reason. Okay. Just saying it's the right thing to do works for some people, but you'll never engage all your stakeholders, and you'll never be able to convince people you need to invest the resources into this if you can't articulate the business case. Yeah. So I'd ask the question, why? Why is it? And the answer might be, well, everyone else is doing it. And I'd ask you, well, go a bit deeper. Yeah. Why do you think other people are focusing on it? How will this benefit your business? And that could be getting more talent, meeting the needs of our stakeholders. We'll be more innovative because we've got complex problems to solve. We've got a talent shortage, whatever it is, but you need to articulate why. The other thing, then the next thing you need to do is figure out where you are now. And that requires you to maybe do a bit of analysis on, what's your demography? You may not know. So there might be some work there. And then the third thing, I think, is to figure out what your priority areas are. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I see people, really well-meaning people, get super enthusiastic and they want to do something in every space. But this is very complex work. And if, for example, they might say, well, we want to be more gender equal. And I would say, well, gender equality is a big thing to solve. It's about representation and leadership. It's about eliminating workplace harassment. It's about creating mainstreamed flexible work through job design. It's about supporting people who are pregnant, breastfeeding, returning to work. It's about the gender pay gap and making sure we pay equitably. Which bit are you going to focus on?
Right.
And then women aren't all the same. Women who have got disabilities or who are lesbians or who are culturally or racially marginalised have different experiences. So what's your take on that? Because if you don't look at your gender question intersectionally, you'll default to one group. So I use that as an example to illustrate this stuff is complex. Yeah. So you need to be really clear about what your priority area is and keep it simple initially, and only focus on a couple of things and resource them effectively. Because this is going to require institutional change.
Yeah. Can I ask you something that's a bit out of, maybe it's a bit of a sidestep here. If you're a candidate, so as you can see, I'm not white and I come from, English is not my second language. Sorry, English is not my first language. All of that. If I were to look for a job and I value going to a place where there's diversity and inclusion. We've all seen those LinkedIn pictures of Pride Day and wearing the purple day, But how do you, as a candidate, really assess an organization whether they actually mean, or they do have those processes as we spoke about within their workplace? How do we assess that from the other side?
It's a really good question. I would say 2 things. And the first thing I would say is that it can be hard to do, but You can do your research on organisations, and a lot of organisations, especially bigger ones, are really transparent with their diversity and inclusion strategies and programs. And you can find a lot of information on that, sometimes in their annual report, sometimes just by doing some research on them. But also you've got to be realistic that just because an organisation's immersed in the space, it doesn't mean they're perfect, but it means they're trying. Yeah. So there's that kind of information that you can assess. And then I think that the proof is always in the pudding. You can go and have a look at their leadership teams in their annual reports. How diverse are they? Mm-hmm. Go and, you can have a look at who's sitting on their boards. How diverse are they? You'll see the outcomes of their work. Yep. And some organisations have created enormous change internally. But the next thing is, why don't you craft a question in your interview around that and just see how they respond. Right. Now, that response will come from the recruiting people, but that's also telling, because an organisation that's deeply committed to this puts demands on their recruiters. Yeah. 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 And if they haven't done it, they haven't done it. Yeah.
Now, the next question will then sort of follow up on that one. As a recruiter, so I'm obviously an external agency recruiter, and I do have to have those conversations and challenging the bias that we spoke about earlier, when there is a perfectly good candidate that can do the job, but somehow all these biases come through. What do you think, what can you recommend us to be better at in terms of advocating and championing these candidates that are overlooked? Is there any other extra things you think we can do?
Yeah, it's a really good question, because I would say if you really have to talk an employer into hiring a candidate who's diverse, that candidate's probably better off not working in that organisation, because it won't be a safe place for them, unfortunately. If they've made up their mind at that stage that, this person's too different, they're always going to be different. I mean, I was speaking to a First Nations person the other day, and they said to their children, you can't make any mistakes, because if you make one mistake, it will be linked to your identity. If other people make a mistake, it's just them making a mistake. But when the First Nations person makes a mistake, or the person who has, then that mistake is linked to their identity. That's not a safe workplace for that individual, and they will struggle in that workplace. So you've got two types of people: really resilient people who create the change, but that's exhausting, and not everyone's equipped to do that, and nor should they be. And I would recommend they try and work for somebody else where they don't have to, overcompensate for their identity. In terms of you being able to influence that with individuals, I mean, this is something I do all the time. And it's really interesting. I use both evidence but also narratives, because sometimes you've got to change people's hearts rather than just changing their minds using data. But you need both. Yep. And it will be effective with some people and you won't be effective with others, unfortunately. But it's a hard thing. I mean, I would always ask people, why do you think the person can't do the role? And often when you get people saying, well, they don't have the merit, and then I'd push back on what is merit. Yeah. Because people will define merit in a very subjective way. But actually, if you've got clear criteria and this person's meeting those criteria, all of those other things are up for challenging. That whole culture fit and team fit piece are up for challenging.
Right. Thank you for that. That was something that I've experienced before. That's why I thought I'd share that with you. So, Lisa, well, it's quite clear that diversity and inclusion need to be championed within a workplace, but I know we've got a long way to go, but it's also good to know that any business can start today to build a workplace that is inclusive for all. For those who are wanting to learn more, where can they find further resources or information?
You can go to our website, www.dca.org.au.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much for your time today. That was fantastic. Thank you.
A pleasure. Thank you. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. See ya.